Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of history here today, looking at the bookends of the Cold War, really, the start and the end.
That's right. We're aiming to cut through, decades of complex history and really focus on two key comparisons. First, the leaders. Harry Truman versus Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, the man who arguably started it all from a position of strength and the one who ended it,
Yeah,
well, out of necessity, it seems.
exactly. And then we'll look at two defining crises, the Korean War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did they shape the conflict, and what do they tell us about the changing nature of Cold War risk?
It's striking when you lay it out like that, the contrast between the U.S. entering this, ideological struggle full of confidence and economic power.
And the Soviet Union leaving it, basically collapsing under its own weight. It really makes you think about how internal factors, especially economics, can dictate the end of these huge global standoffs.
Okay, let's dig into that first comparison then. Leaders. We have to start with President Harry S. Truman. Post-World War II, America couldn't really go back to being isolationist, could it?
No, not at all. And Truman was the one who really cemented that shift. He established the whole U.S. doctrine of containing communism globally.
And that wasn't just talk, was it? It was backed by pretty sophisticated strategy.
Absolutely. You see it formalized in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. The commitment was to support free peoples facing communist threats, but crucially, mostly through economic and financial aid.
Which brings us to the Marshall Plan. Truman famously called the doctrine and the Marshall Plan two halves of the same walnut.
Yes, and that analogy is key. It shows how the U.S. was operating from this position of, well, incredible economic strength compared to the Soviets. The Marshall Plan wasn't just generosity.
Right, it was strategic. Rebuild Europe's economy.
And you reduce the poverty, the desperation, the chaos that makes communism seem like a viable alternative. You stabilize things, you showcase American power and commitment, and you effectively counter Soviet influence without firing a shot initially.
It really was weaponizing wealth in a way. That confidence, though, did it sometimes tip over into something that increased suspicion?
I think you could argue that. Look at the Potsdam Conference, right near the start. Truman was quite cagey with Stalin about the atomic bomb. He hinted at a powerful new weapon, but didn't give details.
Which, from Stalin's perspective,
Must have sounded incredibly threatening. If your supposed ally is hiding game-changing weapons tech, how can you trust them? It definitely poured fuel on the fire of mistrust right from the get-go.
Okay, so that's Truman setting the stage from strength. Now let's jump forward 40 years. Mikhail Gorbachev. He inherits a very, very different situation.
Completely different. Desperate, really. The Soviet system was failing. I mean, the numbers we have are just stark.
Right.
By the mid-'80s, they were pouring something like 25% of their entire GDP into the military.
25%. Compared to, what, 4 to 6 for the U.S. at the time?
Exactly. Utterly unsustainable. And meanwhile, economic growth had just cratered, from over 5% down to about 2%. The system was grinding to a halt.
So it wasn't just stagnation, it was actively consuming itself to keep up militarily.
Precisely. That's why Gorbachev's famous line, "We can't go on living like this," wasn't just rhetoric, it was a statement of fact. His reforms, perestroika, the economic restructuring, allowing some market activity.
And glasnost, the political openness.
They weren't driven by some sudden conversion to Western ideals. They were driven by the cold, hard reality that the Soviet model had failed. They couldn't afford the arms race anymore, especially with Reagan pushing things like SDI.
Right, the Star Wars initiative. Even the threat of having to compete with that kind of technology must have been crippling for Moscow.
It absolutely was. They knew they couldn't match it financially or technologically, so Gorbachev had to change course.
Okay, so let's draw out the comparison. Big differences first. Truman's actions seem primarily external.
Yes, containment, Marshall Plan, NATO. It's all about projecting U.S. power and influence outwards, using economic strength as the main tool.
Whereas Gorbachev's major policies were fundamentally internal, perestroika, glasnost, trying to fix the broken system from within because the external competition was bankrupting them.
Exactly. He needed to reduce military spending, seek détente, basically pull back from the confrontation because the internal weakness demanded it.
So strength driving external action versus weakness driving internal reform. That's the core difference. But what about similarities? They both seem like such pivotal, transformative figures.
Well, the big similarity, I think, is that both leaders radically redefined their country's entire foreign policy approach. Truman took the U.S. from relative isolationism to permanent global engagement and confrontation.
And Gorbachev took the USSR from aggressive confrontation and control over its satellites.
to rapprochement, détente, and ultimately letting the Eastern Bloc go its own way by abandoning the Brezhnev Doctrine. They were both hinge points in history, fundamentally changing their nation's direction on the world stage, just in opposite ways.
That's a really clear way to frame it. Strength versus necessity leading to opposite, but equally transformative shifts.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot now to the crises that define the decades between Truman and Gorbachev, Korea and Cuba.
Right. And here, maybe we can think about it in terms of scope versus risk. The Korean War from 1950 to 53 was huge in scope, and it really militarized the Cold War globally.
It started as a proxy war, right? North Korea invading the South across the 38th parallel. Truman reacted fast.
Very fast. Got the UN involved, helped by the Soviets boycotting the Security Council at that exact moment, which was a massive blunder on their part. But the war aim shifted, didn't it?
Yeah, from containment, just pushing the North Koreans back, to MacArthur pushing north, aiming for rollback, trying to unify Korea under non-communist rule.
And that's what brought China into the war. Suddenly, it wasn't just a regional conflict. It was this massive, brutal, 3-year war involving major powers. Millions died.
And the consequence for U.S. policy was enormous. This is where NSC 68 comes in.
Exactly. NSC 68 was this policy paper recommending a massive permanent increase in U.S. military spending to counter the Soviets globally. It was written before Korea, but the war provided the political justification to actually implement it.
So Korea basically unlocked the U.S. defense budget.
Pretty much. It tripled overnight to around $50 billion a year. It convinced the U.S. public and leadership that containment wasn't just diplomatic or economic. It required a huge ongoing military commitment worldwide. It locked in that high level of spending for decades.
So Korea equals massive scope, conventional war, and long-term militarization. Then fast forward about 9 years to October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very different feel.
Totally different. If Korea was about scope, Cuba was about risk. Pure existential risk. 13 days that brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before or since.
Khrushchev put Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off Florida, partly responding to U.S. missiles in Turkey, right?
That was part of his calculation, yes.
Yeah.
Balancing the strategic threat. But the effect in Washington was sheer panic. You read the accounts, the military chiefs were almost all pushing Kennedy hard for airstrikes, for an invasion.
But Kennedy resisted that immediate military action.
He did. And that's arguably where his leadership was crucial. He understood, or came to understand, that a direct attack on Cuba would likely trigger a Soviet response, potentially escalating uncontrollably towards nuclear war. He opted for the naval quarantine, a blockade, essentially, and diplomacy, high-stakes diplomacy.
Which led to the secret deal. Soviets pull missiles from Cuba, U.S. pulls its Jupiter missiles from Turkey later on.
Right. A compromise born out of mutual terror, really. And look at the immediate aftermaths. They're mirror images, in a way.
How so?
Korea led to a massive military buildup. Tripled defense budgets, NSC 68 fully implemented, global military commitments. Cuba, the moment of maximum danger, actually led to mechanisms for de-escalation.
The hotline being the most famous example, not just a red phone, right?
No, it was a secure teletype link. Direct communication to avoid miscalculation or delay in a future crisis was a direct admission. We almost blew up the world. We need a way to talk instantly if this happens again.
And that led pretty quickly to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 as well.
Exactly. So Korea hardens the conflict, ramps up the spending. Cuba scares everyone so much they start building guardrails. Build up versus cool down, in a sense.
But despite those very different outcomes, militarization versus de-escalation, there's a common thread in how the U.S. saw both crises, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Ideologically, they were seen as critical tests of American will. Kennedy didn't just see missiles in Cuba. He saw it connected to Soviet pressure on Berlin, a way to, quote, blackmail a vulnerable America.
So whether it was conventional war in Asia or nuclear brinkmanship in the Caribbean, the underlying fear was the same. If we back down here, the Soviets will push harder elsewhere. It's all part of the same global test.
Precisely. The stakes were perceived as total, even if the nature of the immediate crisis was very different.
Which brings us back to where we started, in a way. We see Truman setting up this global confrontation, fueled by economic strength and cemented by the massive military expansion after Korea.
And then decades later, we see Gorbachev having to dismantle it, driven by the sheer economic unsustainability of that decades-long competition, a competition whose ultimate danger was starkly revealed during those 13 days over Cuba.
It's fascinating. The realization that came out of Cuba that Nuclear war was unthinkable, and the arms race needed managing it took another 25 years, and the near bankruptcy of the Soviet state for that realization to be fully acted upon by Gorbachev.
It really makes you think. That 25% GDP spend on the military that crippled the USSR, that was the direct legacy of the choices made by Truman and the events like Korea. Without that internal economic collapse, would the Cold War have ended when or how it did?
It's a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. How often is the end of a conflict decided not by victory on the battlefield, but by one side simply collapsing under the economic strain of the competition itself? Something to definitely mull over.